Good afternoon, everyone. I am very delighted to be part of this Scottish Network series, and I have a great pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Oles Andriychuk. Dr. Andriychuk is a senior lecturer in competition and internet law at the University of Strathclyde. He is the director of the Strathclyde Centre for Internet Law and Policy, and runs the center's monthly webinar series. He's also the director of the Strathclyde LLM program in Internet Law and Policy, IT and Telecommunications Law. Oles has published widely, and I would like to name a few most significant pieces of his research. And most importantly, related to today's topic is his recent article exploring the Digital Markets Act, entitled Shifting the Digital Paradigm Towards a Sui Generis Competition Policy, which also received a prestigious Portuguese Competition Authorities 2021 Award for Academic Work in Competition Policy. He also has another article in Digital Competition Law named Shaping the New Modality of the Digital Markets, the Impact of the DSA, DMA, Digital Services Act, Digital Market Act, proposal on interplatform competition, which also received or is nominated for Concurrence 2022 Academic Article Award. And then we also have other fantastic publications, including his monograph, The Normative Foundations of European Competition Law, Assessing the Goals of Antitrust Through the Lens of Legal Philosophy, published in 2017, and his latest article, fantastic article, to be published by Modern Law Review, is on theoretical aspects of competition law, and it is entitled Between Microeconomics and Geopolitics on the Reasonable Application of Competition Law. And referring to today's topic, the growth of digital markets means that it is very important that we continue to support consumers to make sure that we get good outcomes in those digital markets through competition and innovation. It's also important to support businesses. And there have been significant developments in the political and regulatory landscape for digital markets in the UK. So therefore, today's webinar on the UK government's public consultation on a new pro-competitive regime for digital markets is an extremely important and largely debated topic. So, Dr. Andriychuk, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jurgita, for this very kind introduction. And thank you very much, Guido, for giving me the floor. I'm also very grateful to all the participants. I see many familiar faces. So I propose that we will start with an outline of the broader, theoretical trend which underpins and drives this evolution of competition policy in the UK and in other jurisdictions. But the UK is taking the lead in many respects here. And then I'll look into more substantive aspects of the proposal, which is currently being, consulted by the UK government. We don't know when precisely it will be introduced to the Parliament, but we hope that it's a matter of months. So let me start with this rather, succinct slides. And the starting point, of course, that competition policy until recently was rather narrow, focused, pragmatic, mathematics-oriented discipline. It was a niche area, very important. It was always important, but it was never, a big societal a big societal instrument. And now, once over sudden, we start realizing that competition policy will play a significant and maybe even the leading role in recalibrating our new kind of period of digital economy and digital society more broadly. We transitioning from the era of all permissive, hands-off internet optimism, where the vision was support the transformation into the digital, allow the main players, the main actors to be as innovative as possible, and ultimately it will all lead to the greater good of society. And in many respects that was correct, but now definitely we see the total different total change in this approach. Now we see much more pragmatic, much more the expectation is that the platforms will be much more accountable, and in different jurisdictions, once over a sudden we see this significant reforms or the significant appetite and the demand for this paradigmatic shift. And the starting point of this shift concerns primarily the epistemic vision. So we move from the mathematical approach to competition policy, where the truth was given somewhere, and the task of the competition enforcers was primarily to discover this economic truth hidden in the complex mathematical formulas underpinned by neoclassical economics, towards much more societal account, where we all start reminding ourselves that economics is not a natural science, that it's a social science, and there is no pre-discovered or pre-installed correct absolute answers, that it's all part of broader toolkit, regulatory toolkit. And competition policy, it's the new position, it's not a weakness, a recognition of weakness, it's a recognition of the new strength, newly discovered strength of competition policy, and thus it's currently reconsidering its conceptual roots quite significantly. And obviously the question is, okay, what about normative issues? Because in the past, as Jurgita correctly observed, the main criterion was consumer, and that was quite a misleading criterion, because consumer has this intellectual pedigree of being interventionist. But in competition policy, consumer welfare was a tool essentially to protect from intervention as soon as you demonstrate that your otherwise anti-competitive practice contributes to some extent and in a measurable terms to the welfare of consumers. So now we start asking ourselves, particularly in the area of digital economy, what should be this new normative goal? Should we continue being focused primarily on consumers or end users? Or maybe the focus must be on the vertical relationship, or maybe where in the areas where platforms dominate their markets, and maybe we have to bring them just more accountable, ask them to act in a more responsive way, not to change their algorithms and rankings arbitrarily, provide some quasi-public utility expectations to those who dominate the world. And we understand that these markets will be dominated by some. It is in the very nature, it is in the very DNA of digital economy to have some clear-cut winners. It's convenient to this huge network effects make it convenient to have one or maybe two search engines, one or only very few social networks, etc. So it's very unlikely that we will recalibrate the very structure of the digital economy. Maybe it's a matter of just asking the biggest companies to be more accountable. So this is the second dimension. And the third dimension is, of course, is the most ambitious one. Should we try to somehow to open the markets not only on the vertical level, but also horizontally, inviting new participants into the most lucrative parts of this business. And it's currently ongoing. Obviously, it's not a zero-sum game. We can have several concurrent objectives running simultaneously, but still there, we can see that in competition law, economics, and policy circles, we see kind of schools, emerging schools, where the emphasis is placed either on one or another or the third. And thus we face the necessity to be more to introduce, to develop, to elaborate a broader toolkit for talk to other disciplines or to other syllabi, because so much is going on. Even when we talk about digital society, data economy, in every small and narrow niche, in every small silos, the development currently is unprecedentedly rapid. Maybe even too quick, but obviously we have to catch up. And thus we just don't have physical time, physically, we don't have an opportunity to follow everything with sufficient precision and depth. Thus we inevitably, particularly academics, delve deeper into our own narrow niche. And that competition policy, to a large extent, and for many decades, was very self-centered, very isolated, and perceiving any influence even from the government, let alone from other areas of law and economics, as somehow, as unnecessary noise, polluting the clarity of our mathematical formulas. Now we start realizing that it's more polycentric, it's not monocentric, it's not science, natural science-based logic of pure mathematics, which can discover the truth, that it's all, polyvalent and polycentric, and thus we have to develop the mechanism of communication with other disciplines. So that's another ongoing challenge for us. Why competition policy in the digital economy is not particularly successful? Not least, or maybe some say even primarily, because we have endless procedural traps. Most of the cases, if you look at the latest case with Intel, are lost by the Commission as the main enforcer of competition policy on purely procedural grounds, because when millions at stake, you can expect very strong lawyers and economists supporting the position of each party. But when billions are at stake, that would be the best, the most casuistic, the most equipped experts in the dry case language of case law and the dry language of neoclassical economics, econometrics, industrial economics, you name it, who can find nitty-gritty and who can, outperform the legal services of the Commission, for example, very often. So there is kind of this desire to have more, to start it from scratch pretty much. And most of these proposals essentially try to distance themselves from the established language, from the established vocabulary, from the established principles of ex-post competition law. So this new wave of ex-ante regulation develops its own vocabulary, which is free from these procedural traps. Because if we'll continue using the vocabulary too often, the vocabulary of the past, it's likely that we will start losing cases in the situations the least expected for such losses, so to say. So what is the main elements of this new modality of competition rules, which we now observe in various jurisdictions? And the first one is asymmetricity. We abandon this horizontal expectation that, one rule fits all, so to say, that we design the rules asymmetrically in the sense that the rules will be enforced only to those who have this substantial market power and who are essentially are entrenched gatekeepers. They have this strategic market status in the digital economy, and we all know these names of big tech industry, etc. And we will be designing the rules in the way which will somehow mitigate their omnipotence, because they are indeed omnipotent on the digital markets, and there is no realistic opportunity to apply, this traditional mechanism of competition law as we know it effectively. We need to design something new, something which would mitigate this imbalance of power, and thus the rules are asymmetrically. And you can see some elements of unfairness, perhaps, if you apply very categorical yardstick. But this is the only realistic opportunity for enforcers, for legislators, for regulators to catch up. So you can have normative criticism vis-a-vis this policy, and thus say we have to continue with more symmetric approach, but this is the only realistic one. Both supporters and critics probably would agree that realistically it's the only way to go. You can disagree whether it should continue or not. And one of the elements of this asymmetricity is the opacity by design. The rules are full of adjectives, and it's very difficult to comply with. And this opacity by design is done this opacity is done by purpose. It's not a bug of the mechanism, it's distinctive feature. So even if you look at the proposal of the Commission, the Digital Markets Act, which has now been in the trilogue stage, you can see Article 6, which lists a significant portion of obligations of the gatekeepers. Its title is Obligations Susceptible to being further specified. So this further specified mechanism of specification is part of so-called regulatory dialogue, which is kind of part and parcel of the new regime. And thus we understand that we need this future-proofness, because without it, if you introduce clear, precise, well-calibrated, one-dimensional rules, however demanding these rules are, there is 1,001 way to comply with the letter of those rules, but still circumventing its pedigree or its purpose. Thus, we have to have this rule vague, full of adjectives, the references to fairness, proportionality, those which are dependent on the context, and this allows the enforcers to comply with the rule or to enforce the rules effectively, even in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time, because any revision of the rules is so procedurally complex that it's next to impossible to expect any significant revision of the existing rules. Thus, the rules must be brought to cover the future practices as well. We often hear that many of those practices are efficient, that most of the gatekeepers have achieved their status for the right reasons, because they are so good and they deliver excellent services to to their business users, to their end users, and they deserve to have this position. It's a normative question, of course, but what we don't want to have, we don't want the efficiency defense as a shield against any intervention, where you can say, look, I have infringed these rules, but look, there are many benefits from the infringement, and you can list those benefits. So if we enter into this format of discussions, then it's very unlikely that the enforcement mechanism will succeed, because any practice in the digital economy can be justified by some efficiency references. After all, the duopoly in advertising services, it is very efficient for small and medium-sized companies. It matches them in many respects, but obviously doesn't negate the many harms to competition which it keeps creating and exploiting. So it's not a zero-sum game where the practice is either efficient or anti-competitive. It can be efficient while being anti-competitive simultaneously. So we have to abandon this, zero-price black and white approach, where the practice is either pro-competitive or inefficient, because we measure pro-competitiveness not only, or maybe not anymore, with the yardstick of efficiency. Now, the question is how to define those who must be accountable, who will be responsible. And EU uses the terminology of gatekeepers. UK Competition and Markets Authority refers to the mechanism of undertakings with significant strategic market status. And those who are familiar with competition law understand the mechanism in Article 102 of the Treaty on the Function of the European Union. So it's a categorical decision. You are either a gatekeeper, and then the whole spectrum of obligations will be applicable to you, or you are one step behind this criterion, and then you will not be subject to the rules at all. Thus, it's very important to draw this line accurately, because if we care about any realistic horizontal competition, i.e., if we expect to design the rules which would allow or facilitate new entries into these systemically entrenched markets, then we have to anticipate that it's very likely that the new entrants will be not companies from the garages. They will be established market players, because we don't believe in miracles anymore. They will be established market players, and they must be sufficiently strong. And if we draw the line too low, we will capture them too early and impose these obligations too early. But on the other hand, if we draw the line too high, we will miss some companies who are de facto gatekeepers, but they will be the jure not gatekeepers. So it's a kind of a delicate balance to be struck, and it's very, it's almost surgical. It requires almost surgical precision, so to say. The next and important systemic feature of this situation is what I call King Midas challenge, or King Midas paradox. Hans Kelsen was using it. King Midas, that law is like King Midas. Anything it touches, any societal relationship, it turns them into gold, into law. And thus, the logic is that the gatekeepers are so powerful that any rule we introduce, it's very possible that there will be a long list of unintended consequences. Because the best example which we can see, and the most challenging perhaps, is the relationship between competition and privacy. And I see some colleagues who are experts in this field, so I'm happy to elaborate this further during the Q&A part of our meeting. But the logic, the very rationale, is that we understand that most of the gatekeepers have achieved their significant strategic market status by compromising, by exploiting the vulnerabilities of privacy or lacunas of privacy. They were using this mechanism for decades, where the society was not prepared for this. Yeah, so we were ignorant pretty much. For us, until recently, at least for the majority of us, privacy was associated with some celebrity gossips. It wasn't considered about in this kind of dimension of digital footprints. So after exploiting all the opportunities from the kind of Wild West wonderland, now what we see, the recent trend, is that now the gatekeepers send the message that they will be the most effective policemen against violation of privacy. And thus, they basically exploit this new appetite which has emerged in the society for the right reasons. And they say, look, we can protect privacy of our users better than regulators. And that's why we see these initiatives, for example, with abandoning third-party cookies and introducing, trying to disintermediate potential new entrants from their customers and their end users. So it's a very tricky and very problematic situation. And by the way, if you look at the Digital Services Act, which is often labeled as a twin sister or twin brother of the Digital Markets Act, we can see some potential proxies via which the gatekeepers could cement their status quo rather than allow a meaningful entry. And this is a big problem. Again, I'm happy to elaborate it further during the discussion. So the question is how to challenge this entrenched position. And now we move to the UK market, where we see it all started 2019. It sounds like prehistoric times these days. We had it was the year of reports. We had many reports in different jurisdictions, starting from Australia and into the United States, but UK was one of the leading jurisdictions, the so-called Furman report, which put together the greatest experts in the field, competition lawyers, economists, data scientists, all are very, mainstream. They have established reputation in the traditional competition law and economics area, but also simultaneously very forward-looking, very strategically equipped to design the new mechanism. And the report introduced, among other things, the new principle, the new messages to the government and competition authority and broader community, based upon which we have to redesign the new rules. And again, I emphasize that the reform will be, and is, because it's ongoing, will be really significant. It's paradigmatic change. It's not a cosmetic change. A, and B, it will not replace the current rules. It will complement the current rules. So they will coexist, but they will coexist somehow in somehow autonomous way. So you can specialize in the latter without using necessarily the vocabulary, the mechanisms of the former, because if you will embed the later modality, the emerging modality, too much into the previous modality, it is very likely that it will anchor the flexibility and thus limit or constrain the flexibility of the new rules to shape the new pro-competition regime. And here we have two words which we use nowadays very often: pro-competition regime and shaping. And both these terms infer to the proactive mechanism. So it's not responsive mechanism anymore. We don't wait as enforcers, peacefully monitoring for the. We don't wait for the instances of infringement before acting. We see that there are systemic market failures, and it's not enough to remedy these market failures by simply penalizing wrongdoers. We abandon the vocabulary of wrongdoing. We don't blame anybody. We just want to recalibrate the market. That's the idea with which the enforcers try to come to this problem these days. So responsive modality is sufficient. And the proposal, this report in 2019 introduces the so-called the idea of creating within the UK Competition and Markets Authority dedicated Digital Markets Unit, DMU, which currently functions in shadow form because it's still not in the legislation, but it doesn't prevent it from being, this status doesn't prevent the DMU from being very effective. They have engaged into a number of really groundbreaking investigations, mainly in the form of market studies, i.e. they don't go further, they don't go into market investigation, which envisages some strategic remedies, but it shed the lights on many practices, starting from advertising and ending to analyzing the latest mergers, and even prohibiting some really landmark mergers in the area of digital economy. Obviously, it's not done by the DMU itself, but by its mother, Competition and Markets Authority. Finally, they have discussed in this proposal, finally for the purposes of my message, so of my paper, the so-called regulatory dialogue. If you're talking about intentional vagueness of the rules, if you're talking about the rules which are designed to be open-ended in order to be future-proof, thus we have to fine-tune these rules in the form of regulatory dialogue. And this regulatory dialogue allows the enforcers to sit and talk to the gatekeepers and communicate to them clear messages, what we want them to do. And thus the gatekeepers are expected not only to comply with the letter of law, but also with the expectations of the enforcers. And why I call it a carrot-stick tool? Because it can be carrot in the sense that we can design during this regulatory dialogue the rules in a kind of more gatekeeper-friendly way. If you're talking about 20 rules, some of them could be more softer and enforced, so to say. So we can promise to turn the blind eye, at least temporarily, to some practices in order to make them responsible and force them to comply with other specific rules, but to comply not pro forma, but realistically. However, it is also a stick because, for example, in very sophisticated tool of the Digital Markets Act, we see that obligations, while being while being susceptible to further specified within the regulatory dialogue, the liability begins not ex tunc but ex nunc, not ex nunc but ex tunc. So from the moment when the obligation emerged, not from the moment when it has been refined or purified or narrowed down during the regulatory dialogue. So we, by this very, very simple game theoretical tool, we nudge the gatekeepers to comply, and we nudge them to knock on the doors of the innkeeper, of the enforcers, rather than not opening the doors when the enforcers knock on their virtual symbolic doors. So this is it's all started with this Unlocking Digital Competition report, also known as Furman report, because it was chaired by an American economist, John Furman, I believe. And then we had really paradigmatic UK Competition Market Authority online platforms and digital advertising market study, which running from 2019-2020, and it has introduced a number of really, groundbreaking in terms of its revelations and in terms of its broader societal impact messages to all the stakeholders, so to say. And the starting one is that advertising, we all somehow start realizing from this market study, the power, the omnipotence of online advertising, that it is really kind of that 90+% of the revenues generated by big tech comes from advertising. So it's kind of main conversion point where you convert your digital power into your monetary power. And it's been developing further and further. So if you want to understand how the digital economy works, advertising is the main proxy for its understanding, because it's a main money maker, not only for big tech, but for other industries as well, or for their competitors. And here we have unavoidable, undisputable duopoly by Google and Meta. They generate, they control 90+% of market, at least in the UK, but in other jurisdictions which apply competition law, as we understand it, the market share is comparable. Only those jurisdictions which are more authoritarian and which have introduced immediate walls against the market entries of these two players in order to develop their own domestic big tech companies, we see their presence much lower, or maybe even their absence, so to say. It's another dilemma. It's a real dilemma. On one hand, we don't want the even smart authoritarianism being invoked in the kind of fertile soil of liberal democracies. On the other hand, we have to learn, or at least from purely observational point of view, we have to see the mechanics in order to understand how this process works, so to say. And this is very tempting, for many enforcers. Also, we understand that online advertising affects various sectors. It's not only about, entertainment, or it's not only about digital sensu stricto. It covers media industry, it covers all possible aspects, starting from traveling and ending to agriculture. We are all dependent on advertising, and traditional players are struggling, particularly media industry. They are being disintermediated from their readers and then from their advertisers. Everywhere we have an intermediary, either Google or Meta. And again, they are very effective. That's another paradox, so to say. They help to reach the right customers. They help to reach the right readers, the right advertisers. So they are effective intermediators. But how they achieve this level of effectiveness, that's another open-ended and rhetorical question. Yeah, we all know the mechanisms. And then another problematic question: do we want new companies to act differently? Is it even possible to act differently? Should we, tolerate this mechanism as inevitable and try to allow new entrants based on pretty much the same or comparable principles? Or maybe we have, on the contrary, should say, okay, let us keep the current gatekeepers as they are, but let us just strengthen the rules which they were operating in the laissez-faire modality. Now they will be operating in a much more constrained modality. And maybe we will avoid most of market failures by bringing them to accountability, by making them more compliant with the new, much more paternalistic or much more pro-intervention spirit or appetite which we witness in our society. And privacy obviously is one of the main toolkits here. So how do we continue using our privacy rules? Do we have to strengthen them further and make Google and Facebook also the proxies of this the most strict rules? Or do we have to allow others to use the mechanism of the past? Irresolvable dilemmas. Then this digital markets task force published in 2020 their recommendation to the government about the need to introduce new legislation, and they have outlined the main mechanism. So the main mechanism will be as follows: we will have in the UK specific undertakings designated with the status of strategic market state, designated with strategic market status, SMS. And it will be a very narrow pool of these undertakings. Currently, within the context of this market study on online advertising, on digital platforms and online advertising, we are talking about primarily Google and Meta. There will be others, of course. We bear in mind that when we talk about big tech, we usually talk about 5-7 companies. So it's very likely that those companies will be covered. The specificity of the UK regime is that we will not cover the entire company, but only the segment which is essentially a bottleneck, which has this entrenched position, preventing others from functioning properly. And those narrowly designated or bespokely designated companies will have to comply with the mandatory code of conduct, where most of the rules will be designed for them specifically, bearing in mind their market situation, market mechanism, business models, etc. So this code of conduct will be designed specifically for this company, and the expectation will be that by complying with these rules, which are essentially, my understanding of this mandatory code of conduct, will be essentially a reinterpretation or contextual interpretation of the existing broad, all-inclusive ex-post competition rules. So there will not be significant revision of the rules itself. And then if we see that this mechanism doesn't work, if the mandatory code of conduct is not sufficient, in this case, we are talking about pro-competitive interventions, which would aim to remedy market failures, that it will be kind of a recognition that we witness a systemic market failure. And this pro-competitive modality will be, then the new pro-competitive modality will be introduced, and it will go beyond the existing rules, like significantly beyond the existing rules. And the final element is the more proactive enforcement of merger control, because we understand that most of big tech companies, they just hoover up small and medium-sized companies, real potential hypothetical competitors, non-competitors as well. There are many many objectives for this. Some are to strengthen their position, others just to do so-called killer acquisition, and many other in between. But this control must be strengthened, and now we see already some mechanisms or some enforcement in action in the UK, where the merger between Giphy and Meta was dismantled. And the government responded to this proposal of the Digital Markets Task Force and introduced public consultation, which it's now been closed and it's now being analyzed. So the expectation is that it will be published very soon in the following months, in spring 2022. And they basically want to look at some of the criteria, how to fine-tune the mechanism of this Digital Markets Unit, how much discretion it should be assigned to it, how to apply these new standards for merger control. Because on one hand, we want a regime, this autonomous unit within Competition and Markets Authority, which will be equipped with sufficient independence and sufficient power and competence to do these proactive, pro-competitive interventions. On the other hand, we also, as a government, I say we also want to communicate our strategic expectation. Because remember, I started this conversation with the notice that there is an epistemic shift. We don't know anymore, with absolute certainty at least, what is the goal of competition law. Because in the past, we knew that the goal is hidden somewhere between the economic formula, the mathematical formulas, that it's difficult to discover, but it is discoverable. Yeah, the right answer, if you use the terminology of Ronald Dworkin, so to say. Now it's a polycentricity. It's competition policy is getting more about mechanism, how to create this cocktail of blend mixture of different goals, in what proportions. And the fear is that the Digital Markets Unit, if it's granted with such strategic powers, it also must be somehow informed about broader societal expectations, priorities, strategic priorities, and who better knows these strategic priorities than the government, the legitimately elected government. So that's kind of an attempt to calibrate the model, which would allow both autonomy and independence and more proactive approach, but in the same time, broader awareness of other goals etc., while not interfering into independence, of course. So it's a delicate path between Scylla and Charybdis, so to say. And finally, some observation. I have responded to this public consultation as well, and I wanted to stress that it's important to design the modality of communication between the Digital Markets Unit and other competition and other sectoral enforcers, but we shouldn't expect them to function as one big broad digital unit, so to say. We have to realize that each sectoral enforcer has its own discourse, its own path dependence. We shouldn't combine all the narratives into one big synthetic hodgepodge, so to say. The competition policy must be about competition policy. The privacy policy must be about privacy policy on one hand. On the other hand, there are so many opportunities for cross-fertilization and for using and reinvigorating each other. And now we see, particularly with competition and privacy, we see remarkable examples of how this is being done. The problem or the concern is not to move from this kind of complete neutrality and self-isolation narrative to the opposite narrative of uncritical merger of all policies into one broader vision. Because if we are susceptible to doing so, it's very likely that the least prioritized objectives or the least clear, the least popular objectives will be marginalized. And I think competition would be one of those, because it's easy to communicate all other societal values, but the value of having horizontal entry into this entrenched market is not very easy to convert into broader societal vocabulary and apparatus. The next question was how to strike the balance between certainty and flexibility. And here I think it's pretty much inevitable that we have to compromise certainty. Certainty is a kind of an illusionary concept. Obviously, there will always be constraints from legal, hard law, as well as soft law, as well as case law, as well as interpretation, as well as academic discussions, and from economic angles. But the preference must be given to flexibility. So the situation is so rapidly changing that if we design the Digital Markets Unit and constrain it with the existing vocabulary of competition law, which is currently appears to be the case, it's very likely that they will start losing cases on procedural ground as well. So it must be, if you want to start it from scratch, start it from scratch. Don't embed it into the previous narrative, so to say, too closely. Summing up, so the starting point, we have to choose priorities. They coexist. It's not to say that it's either or, but we have to be aware that they are often, it's more than 100%. That sometimes if you want to enhance competition on a horizontal level, we have to somehow tolerate some violation of competition on the vertical level, and vice versa. Plus, we have also competition between big tech as ecosystems, and this is probably the least clear situation, because on one hand, if they compete with each other, trying to penetrate it into each other's market, it's kind of, from the classical competition toolkit, it's a healthy competition. On the other hand, we all realize that if we allow this to happen, we basically say we say goodbye to any even hypothetical meaningful horizontal entry, because then they will continue competing between themselves, maturing themselves, strengthening their algorithmic power endlessly, and thus no new entrant, leaving aside geographical dimension, no new entrant will be able to enter into this market. Do we want it? So we have to discuss this issue. Maybe we want it indeed. Now, the second point is designating SMS. It's a really crucial stage, because remember, it's not pyramidal. It's not that the bigger you are, it's not DSA logic. Yeah, it's a DMA logic. It's you either a gatekeeper, and then the avalanche of obligation is imposed on you, or you are not, and then you are completely free, so to say. So it's not that the bigger you are, the more obligations you receive. So it's really important to designate the criteria of this SMS. Obviously, they will be bespoke in the UK and will be, context dependent, but it doesn't diminish the importance of these obligations, of the designation process. Another important element, don't forget about privacy paradox, and it is extended everywhere. Don't expect consumers and business users to tell you what to do. they are happy with many, statistically happy. They tell you that they don't like it, but most of them are used to this business model. Even app developers, we hear app developers everywhere complaining. But you know, many complain, but many are, particularly those who have already found their niche. If you have multiplicity of app stores, it's very likely that their position of app developers and those who do their business via app stores will be somehow challenged. So they are happy with status quo. Many companies and many users are happy with status quo. Don't expect too much from this side. Have the strategic vision, implement this vision, listen to others, but don't be driven. You shouldn't be driven by these others' voices, because there is no harmonious view to this. Also, the last point perhaps is innovation and welfare. We often hear that, you know, innovation should be the driving force of all this technology. But the question is, innovation for whom? Innovation in what? In making it further and further, in making it better and better, all this profiling. So we have to be careful with innovation. And I stop here. Happy to discuss it further.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Oles, for your insightful presentation. And, you know, we see there are still many challenges that we do have to face, and many questions. You raised quite a few questions, provided some answers, but we still